My name is Gabe Hartfield, and excited to be doing a live stream with my friend Peter DeHaan, and very excited about that and getting to have a conversation about online church and virtual church, and some conversations that I think are really important for the church and for young people and for people of all sorts, especially if you've gone to online church through the last year, especially with the pandemic. And real quick, just want to give Peter a chance to introduce himself, and then we'll continue on from there.
Thanks, Gabe. I'm an author and a blogger, and I write about God and the church and how that applies to our lives. And I've gotten about two dozen books out, and online church, I think, is number 22 or something. So I'm very excited to talk about it.
Yeah, great. I think real quick, I was thinking, just because we're getting started, I wanted to share just really quick about your website so people could see just a little bit about some of the other books that you've done, and share about that as we get started. So
Right.
Just wondering if we could share that real quick here. And the link should be in the Facebook page there too. So if you're jumping on, you should be able to see that as well. Great, there we go. So see, we've got Peter DeHaan's book here, Visiting Online Church. And I actually have a copy of it myself.
All right.
Reading it. Yeah, and Peter, how'd you get to the point of writing this book?
Well, you had forgotten about it till we talked about it a couple of days ago. You'd actually suggested this topic to me, I think well over a year ago. And it was, you were thinking of my book, 52 Churches, where my wife and I spent a year visiting a different Christian church every Sunday. And then I wrote about the book. And you thought visiting online church would be a good follow-up to that. And I agreed, and I wrote it.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think that for me, just this past year, with so many people going to churches online, I think that it's a really helpful book. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit broader about just virtual church and online church, and talk about the nature of it, because I feel like with technology evolving so quickly, church has got to also think about, should they do this? Is it something that, all the different questions about should they do it, how should they do it, how should they engage online audiences with these tools? I've heard people ask, like, would Paul the Apostle do it? Anyways, so just a lot of questions talking about that. And I think that for me, one of the questions about why does this matter is because I remember when I was doing InterVarsity, a college ministry at Davenport, that I had a student who came up to me and said, Gabe, I have watched 3 sermons online this week, and I've also listened to a bunch of worship music. Do I have to go to church? And I just remember I think I talked to you about this, and you said maybe asking the wrong question, but the answer is still yes. Because, in Hebrews, I think it's Hebrews 10, it talks about how we're not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together. So in light of that, and in light of also just having so many churches that have moved online so quickly, trying to think about why this conversation matters. And I think there's a lot that goes into it. Anything else you'd say about why this conversation, just broader, matters to the church and to
Sure.
Christians?
Yeah, that's a great overview you gave there, and we had so many things we could jump off on and talk about. But as I was writing the book, I thought probably about the time I get this published, we will be going from online to in person, and is it going to really matter? And I quickly realized that yes, it does matter. And what we've just experienced in the last year and a half about being forced to go virtual or online is something that unfortunately we could expect to happen again in the future. Either this outbreak flares up again and forces us to go back online, or there's another pandemic in the future. I think we would be naive to think that this was a one and done situation that's never going to reoccur again. Um, so we really should be prepared for next time it happens, because I think it's going to happen. And a year and a half ago, a lot of churches were scrambling. A lot of churches that didn't have any online presence for their service were scrambling because they needed to get technology together. They needed to figure out how to use it. They needed to figure out how to get their congregations involved. And now we have time to think about it, time to plan, and time to get ready for next time that we need to use this. But that's just one reason why online church is so important. A second reason, which I didn't realize until I started researching the book, is that all along there have been people on the fringes who couldn't go to church in person. And their only option for
Oops, sorry. Keep going.
their only option was to try to find some online scenario. And for some of them, it was they had a work conflict. Others, they had responsibilities at home to care for infants or care for elders and couldn't go to church. Some of them had health concerns, either concerning that they were vulnerable and might pick up a virus or some sort of bug at church, or that they had something they didn't want to share with other people at church. And the fourth category, which I had never really thought about, is there's people with social anxieties that want a church experience, but the thought of going out and meeting other people in public just so terrifies them, and they're really stuck to their home and they can't leave. And so for those people without an online option, they have no chance whatsoever for any church connection. And I think it's really important that we don't forget about those people.
Yeah, so there's certain groups that aren't able to attend like in person, and so sometimes having virtual options is a helpful thing for that. If anybody's just joining, we're having a conversation about online church, virtual church, and why it matters with author Peter DeHaan here, who wrote this book, Visiting Church Online. And you're able to comment on Facebook here, any questions that you might have or comments. I'm going to be asking a couple questions, but feel free to post those questions if you have some. A question I had actually is, how did you go about researching this book? Like, what did your journey look like, and how did you do that? So,
great question. But before I answer that, I'm going to give you one more reason why online church is important. And this was something that I discovered in talking with one of the pastors whose church I visited, and he made the comment kind of offhand, which was very profound. He says, I think that online may be the new front door to churches, that people aren't going to walk there in person to like first experience it online to see if it might be a good match for them. And that was so astute, and I think every church needs to be thinking about that. When I visited 52 churches, there the thing was, the churches have a website. And for today's modern crowd, if they don't have a website, they're going to view the church as not viable. And so back then, a website was important, but now I think having an online service is equally important. So,
actually, I was just reading that this morning, and it's on page 67 where you talk about that, where streaming is the new front door, and so that people are like checking that before attending in person.
Yep.
So. Yeah, and it's fascinating to me because I know some people in the video game world that you ask them who their best friends are, and a lot of times they'll say they've actually never met their best friends in person.
Right.
They've only known them online. So just, the way people interact and socialize and culture, it changes. So there's just a lot that's changing with that. So.
Yes. Okay, now I can answer the question you asked.
Yeah.
When I started researching this book, I started with my own experience with my own church, where we went online. We thought it was for 2 weeks, and it was for 4 weeks, and then it was kind of open-ended. And so I chronicled my journey going to my church online, and I interspersed with that visiting other churches online. And what I did is I asked people on my email list, is your church online, and would you recommend I check it out? And some people said, my church is online, but don't check it out. But many of them were proud of their church and what they were doing. And so I got a whole list of churches to check out. I think it was 40 or 50 churches. And I didn't talk about all of them in my book, but I did talk about several of them. and kind of intersperse that with my own journey of going online, going back in person, kind of, sort of, going back online, and just dancing back and forth between the two extremes as things change on a daily basis.
Yeah, no, it's good. So I think that one of the things I found interesting is, yeah, you documented each of your church experiences, even when they did, I thought it was so interesting. There was one where you talked about going to drive-in church, which could be its own book in itself, I feel
Right.
like, outdoor experiences. And I love how you distinguished between, and maybe this is a helpful thing for our listeners, but you distinguish between how there's a continuum of different online church experiences. Do you want to say anything about that
Sure,
quickly?
sure. Um, Let me give some background information first. As I was going through this and researching it, I realized that online church services fell in two categories. One was uh, content that was custom made for online, where it might be someone in their house.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a like one church, one service was the pastor was down in his basement and it was really dim, and he used that as an object lesson to talk about his message. Another time he was on his treadmill, and so those are things that you can't easily do in person, but they work really well online. And for those informal interactions, it reminded me of a YouTuber where they're just in front of the screen, and the edits may not always be smooth as they cut parts out, edit and everything, but you don't care about that. You care about connecting with them and hearing what they have to say. And the other type of service was where they try to replicate what happens in person,
Hmm.
either through a live stream or through faking it. There was some services where everything on stage was normal, but wasn't a single person in the auditorium. And then there were some where they would put together different segments. They would do the worship segment, the announcement segment, the message segment, the wrap-up segment, and then they would splice them all together.
Hmm.
And for all of those exist on a continuum. We're at the very basic level. There's someone's got a camera set up in the back of the auditorium. It's set for a wide angle. They turn on the microphone, and they just don't touch the camera the whole service. And for someone who is connected with that congregation and is used to what happens there, that's fine for them because they're
Hmm.
seeing the people they know and are used to. But for a visitor, they're not going to equate that experience to a YouTuber. They're going to equate that to a concert or a presentation that they see online, and they're going to expect very professional, nice, smooth edits, clear video, nice audio, and so a lot of our online
Hmm.
church experiences are going to fall short of that, and people are going to judge the church negatively, either rightly or wrongly. They're going to judge the church negatively because of that. And so then you go, okay, now you have two cameras. You might have a camera operator that can zoom and pan and all these things, and it just keeps getting more and more complex and requires more and more people to make it all work. And at the very extreme are the churches that have been doing streaming for years, and they have it down to a very professional production that would rival anything you would see online produced by a major network.
Exactly. Yeah. Like some that are just high production quality, very fancy with their camera
Right,
angles. The sound quality is really good. And I think that when people were navigating this, there was, you're right, like sometimes it was just more for the people that already came. And
right.
so like less production quality, less formal. But then you have some really interesting and maybe sometimes awkward experiences, like people trying to sing worship together on Zoom, and one person's camera is picking up the audio and the other person's is not. So you have, I don't know, I've seen that happen, and it's fun the first couple times, and then the next few times you can tell who can sing and who can't. But um,
As
yeah,
for me,
no.
I'd be mouthing the words because I can't sing.
um, I think that another like question in that though with the continuum is there's online church, which like sometimes it's like pre-recorded, or like college classes, sometimes they have all their sessions pre-recorded
Mhm.
versus sometimes they have what they call real-time virtual. So you're like attending it and your camera's on and you're engaged in the class versus just listening to all the lectures ahead of time. So, um, yeah, that's good. And then you also sent out a survey too in the book, right?
I did. It's not a survey, and it's not a survey that we could, um, that's mathematically sound, because I didn't do a good random cross-section. It was just people that follow me, read my books, my blog posts, and who wanted to take part. So these were people that were highly engaged in church, much more so than the average person in the country or in the world. But I did get some good insight from them, and sometimes they gave um, alternate perspectives. Like a few people said that they didn't like to have church at home because there's too many distractions,
Hmm.
whereas another person said they liked church at home because there's fewer distractions. So it's
Hmm.
all a matter of perspective.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, no, I found those really helpful to look through some of their responses.
Mhm.
Um, I'm going to ask a question, then I'm going to look at Facebook to see if there's other questions people are posting. But one of the questions I was going to ask is, in general, just how was the experience for you? What did you enjoy? And then what did you find challenging about virtual church? Like, yeah, both extremes there. What did you enjoy? And then what parts did you find challenging?
Okay. Um, what I enjoyed and what many people in my survey pointed out is that when you go to church online, you don't need to dress up. You don't need to get in your car and drive someplace. You can just sit down and within there seconds, you're connected online. And so it's very convenient and requires not a lot of effort to take part. And although for me, the connection with people before and after the service is very important, for some people, they find that very difficult to navigate. And so they were happy to be able to avoid those conversations with people before and after the service. In fact, one person said when he went to church, he didn't like it because he had to answer the question of, why don't you come more often?
Hmm.
Which was kind of a negative snowball effect of, well, you hassle me about it, I don't want to come anymore. So
Hmm.
I just got sidetracked. Let's see, what was your original question?
Just
Oh,
what did
what I
you do here?
liked. Uh,
Yeah.
what concerned me was, um, as I mentioned, I go to church for the community, which really doesn't happen during the message or the music that happens before and afterwards. And that's really hard to have community when you're online. And some churches had varying degrees of integrating or allowing that community to happen. One great way is to have the chat feature open in Facebook during the live stream. And some churches, it was pretty much people would show up, say hi, and they wouldn't chat the whole rest of the service. In other churches, there was interaction going back and forth the whole time. People um, reposting what the pastor just said that they really liked, or talking about the song or something like that. And there was interaction between the participants who are watching. So that was a form of community.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. So interaction, would you say that you feel like in order for it to count as church per se, would it need interaction? Or I see one of the questions here is like, could we just reduce the gospel to just TikTok snippets or TED Talks? Um, so like, I guess the question would be, can it just be something pre-recorded that we're listening to? Or is it demand interaction?
Great question. On a basic level, it could be pre-recorded that we just absorb passively. But I think to really get the benefit of it, there has to be a way to interact in some form. And obviously that interaction is easier when you're in person.
Hmm.
It's easier when you're in person not wearing masks. Masks do hamper effective communication. But online, if you're just going there to watch the service and you're not interacting with anyone, it's kind of like your friend at college who said, well, I've watched the service online, I've listened to worship music online, do I need to go to church? And,
Yeah.
he had checked off the two commonly thought boxes, but the third box is community. So
Mm.
that's why I would say you need to go to church is for that community.
For the community piece, yeah.
Yes.
I think one other thing I'm just curious about when we get kind of to that is like, should church, I think of when we think of everybody jumping onto technology and, watching church online, it reminds me of that quote in Jurassic Park where Dr. Malcolm, played by, I think it's Jeff Goldblum, he's the chaotician, And he says, your scientists were so focused on what they could do that they never stopped to ask, should they do this, right? I might be saying it a little bit off, but I guess the question would be like, yeah, like kind of getting to that, if it demands interaction, like, can it be just online? Does that, yeah, is that church? And I think even in some of the most recent, if anybody's been watching the rise and fall of Mars Hill, some of the episodes in there are kind of asking some of that questions. And there's an interview in there that they mention that has James McDonald, Mark Driscoll, and another pastor, and they're all talking about this discussion about whether or not church can be satellite campuses. And they talk about how Mars Hill had like 11 satellite campuses or something like that. And the other pastor mentions that the Greek word ekklesia means gathering or assembly. So I guess like just curious what your thoughts are on that. Like, does it have to be in person, or is virtual like fit that definition of assembly or gathering?
Yeah, I think that to get the most benefit from it, there has to be a way to interact. And usually that is in person, but it can be online. One of the churches that we visited online, at the end of the service, they had communion. They said, if you're part of our gathering, go to your area's Facebook page. So they had divided their church into different segments or areas, and each one had their own Facebook page. So they would go there to the Facebook page and have communion together with those people in the group. And then for everyone that wasn't associated with one of these Facebook pages, to stay in with the main feed and have communion with those folks. So that was a way of interaction. The application of technology and can we do it and should we do it, that's a very interesting thing. I've seen that sometimes in in-person services, and I'm wondering, do you really need a smoke machine during the worship set to maximize our ability to worship? And I think that, in my opinion, that's an idea of something we can do but probably shouldn't do. And I apologize for everyone who I just offended who runs the smoke machine at their church, but there are a lot of things in that same area where we can do it, but we shouldn't do it. And the thing about technology is it allows us to scale quickly and massively. And so when there is a failure, such as what you talked about for Mars Hill, and I should point out that this is not Mars Hill in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is Mars Hill in Seattle, Washington, that is no more. But their scaling using technology just allowed their failure to be much more widespread, much more felt. So with technology, I'll butcher this quote, but with power comes responsibility or something.
Oh, great power comes great responsibility.
I knew you could do it for me.
Spider-Man.
Yes. So that's something to keep in mind is, if you have a congregation of 10 that meets in person and you fail, you affect 10 people. But if you have a massive worldwide ministry that affects 1 million and you fail, you affect a lot of people.
Yeah. Yep. So technology enhances just whatever you do, basically.
Bad.
Yeah. I think on the podcast too, it talks a little bit about how often we say technology is neutral, but often it's doing something or it's affecting things, right? And so I think that kind of just to that point, it seems like technology, it enhances what happens in church for better or for worse. I think another question I had is, what reasons should the church embrace virtual platforms? And then I guess on the flip side, what reasons should the church avoid virtual platforms? Like, is there any that you find and say, yeah, they should avoid that in terms of that platform, anything like that?
Okay. Well, the reasons are, and I'll recap them because we covered them very early in our recording, so anyone that's joining us late, the reasons to do it is that we very likely find ourselves in this situation again where we need to go online and can't meet in person, so we better be ready for it. The other is that there are people on the fringes of society that, for whatever reason, can't go to church in person, and we shouldn't ignore them. We should make options available for them to connect.
Mm-hmm.
And the third reason is that, as one pastor said, online streaming is the new front door to church. And I don't think we should forget that a great way of attracting new people is letting them first experience this online, hopefully in a good way, and then they can come and visit us in person. So the other side of that question is concerns, and that's not something I really covered in my book and haven't thought of too much. I suppose the concern is if you are sharing something online that shouldn't be shared. And a very basic example of this is a couple of the churches, they were very careful in their streaming to only show the officiants of the service, the priest and the organist, and were very careful not to even show the back heads of people who were there in person. And they felt that this was a very important issue of privacy that they wanted to protect and not show their congregant online. And I respect that, and I understand that. But I think also, if there's a video camera in church, you are kind of going to expect that you might be have your image captured on that. So, another concern is if something happens at church that is a very private and personal matter, it's one thing to share it with your church family in person, but it's another for it to be recorded on the internet for anyone across the world to see if they want to see it. And so that's something that we need to be careful of as well.
Yeah, yeah. If there's something that's shared that's more personal or stuff like that, yeah. I'm interested because I do know that a lot of people, their churches switch to doing communion at home or different things like that, or even like how kids' church worked, like Sunday schools and stuff like that, like how churches modified to do that. And just seeing a lot of different, I think it's also a place for innovation, and that the church should also be a place that's safe to experiment and learn new ways of doing things. And that the church the method always needs to be flexible. I'm curious also, through this experience of checking out a bunch of different churches online, and I looked at the back and there was a list of a bunch of churches that you went to online. What did you learn? Like, what was something that you'd say? I think each chapter has a takeaway. I'm curious, like, what would be your main takeaway from the book and from this journey, or any interesting stories you want to share with that too?
Okay, great. I'll give you two takeaways. And this also goes back to something we covered earlier, but it's good to reiterate it and hit it again. If you're doing custom content online, I think follow the example of YouTubers and engage with your audience and make it very personal and just have that closeness there. And there it's what you say and how you present yourself is what matters. As long as the audio is sharp and the video is sharp, the audio is clear, that's the main thing. So you don't need professional edits. You don't need to really put a lot extra technology into it. And so I think that's the model, is to one, go after the YouTuber vision, YouTuber approach, if you will. The other is if you're not doing that and trying to replicate a live service, there I think quality is very important, because the expectation of viewers is going to be very high. And so I don't want someone to just say, okay, we throw up a camera in the back of church, turn it on, and we're good to go. That's going to turn off more people than it's going to help and encourage. So I think in that respect, the quality of production is very important. And don't go down that path unless you're ready to do what you can do to make it be a quality production.
Yeah. Got another question here that someone posted, but or John posted: is the church pacifying people with their social anxiety to the detriment of their spirituality by allowing people to view church solely online? So I guess, like, is it maybe what's getting at it, the question here is it actually to people's detriment spiritually to just allow them to view it only online? Like, does that, how does that affect that?
Great question, John. Thanks for asking it. There is a very real concern there. And I think that's something that each person needs to answer themselves, not each church, but each person. And I am an introvert by nature, but yet over the years I have conditioned myself, trained myself to go to church, do my best in my introverted way to interact with people. But then after not going in person for over a year, it was very hard for me to go back. And I wasn't used to talking to people. I had forgotten how to do it because everything I'd done was online or done solo. And so there are people that, like me, that would probably very easily retreat to online. And those people need to ask themselves, is this what's good for me? And they probably need to push themselves to interact with people in person and not resort to online. But there are other people with very deep social issues that it would just be impossible for them to do it. They just physically could not make themselves get in the car and drive to church. And for them, they're probably in counseling, they're probably on medications to deal with it, which are only partially effective. And for them, the only opportunity for them to have any spiritual connection is online. And so to make a blanket statement from a church perspective, this is good, this is bad, I think that's the wrong question. I think we need to encourage each person to ask themselves, what's best for me in the long term? Don't take the easy way out, but think what's best for you.
Yeah, great. And I think I heard a quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer where he says, whoever can't be in community should beware of being alone. And whoever can't be alone should beware of being in community, because they tend to use the opposite wrong. And so like myself being an extrovert, sometimes I can, overuse church or use it maybe in the wrong ways. And so it's sometimes like also needing to learn from introverts or different things, to how to process spiritually on my own as well too. So, and Jesus does talk about it. He says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there in their midst. And so it does talk about gathering like physically together. And I guess the question would be, once, more of the pandemic seemed to subside and people were able to move back in person, I guess the question would be is if somebody had moved fully online in church, should they transition and move back? Or is it okay to remain virtual?
I think that's, again, another question that each person should ask individually. People have varying degrees of comfort level being in person. Some are still being extremely cautious, and I respect that, and they don't feel it's safe for them physically to go back to church, whereas other people are very free to integrate back in, to try to reconnect with society as they once did. And for those people that are, they're going back to restaurants, they're shopping in person, they're going to movie theaters, and for them to stay home for church, that's probably a cop-out for them, because they're engaging in society in other ways, so they should probably engage in society in church online, or not online, but in person as well. So I think that's, each person needs to ask themselves, when is the right time to go back? And then not take the easy way out and just say, oh, it's just so easy to walk into the living room on Sunday morning and sit in my recliner and turn the TV on. That's not the right answer.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things with this is the church always is going to have to engage new advances in technology and decide how they're going to still follow Jesus in the midst of that and how to do community well. I was thinking and heard somebody mention recently about the printing press when that came out and the Bible was mass produced. Were people thinking, oh no, the Bible, you can read it on your own now, you don't need to read it at a church or hear it read to you. And so that was an advance in technology, and I think we've learned how to work with that, and so we need to learn how to work with a variety of advances in technology. I think one of the things that's helpful is not viewing online content as a substitute for church. So like if you listen to Matt Chandler's sermons, one of the things he does online is he always says, thanks for listening. We appreciate you, tuning in and hope this is a helpful resource. But he always gives this caveat and says, but we don't ever want this to take the place of the local church. And so I just think that's a really helpful thing. And sometimes listening to these pastors in other parts of the country or parts of the world, it's helpful to hear what they're talking about but really we also need the gospel preached into our local context and what we're doing there. So any last comments or stories that you wanted to share on the book?
Yes, thanks for asking. Something did come to mind. One thing is that when you're watching online, you can choose to be completely passive, which is easy to do, or you can try to engage in service, which is harder to do. But to engage, when they're singing, you sing along.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if the Holy Spirit says, raise your arms in worship, even though you're by yourself or maybe with one other person, you still do it because that's what the Holy Spirit tells you to do. And that helps, even though you're still at a distance, it helps you connect and feel more in tune with what's going on there. Whereas if you're just, well, for example, when you watch a football game, you just don't sit there like this, regardless of what happens. When there's a good play, you're fist pumping and you're cheering and you might even stand up and jump up and down. Have that same attitude for church. Engage physically with it and participate.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like it kind of feels awkward at first if you're by yourself or with just a couple people to stand and do worship, but I think it's helpful to engage and to be a part of what's happening wherever you're at.
Correct.
And I think you talk in your book too about some of the interactions and how there's even virtual church where you can create an avatar. Is that what you said?
Yes, that's a good thing for us to mention. When I first started researching this book, I was going to call it virtual church. And I went down this rabbit hole and I discovered there's virtual reality church. And it's been around for 4 or 5 years. And I do have a chapter about virtual reality church, which is very interesting. But I didn't go there in person, and I didn't have any experiences that I documented in my book. But it was very interesting because the founders of this church didn't set out to make a virtual reality church. It's kind of where God led them. And one of their initial concerns was people would make their avatar to go to church in virtual reality, and they were afraid that people would, behind this persona of an avatar, could be a false them. That we hear about online all the time, where a man posing to be a woman, or vice versa, or an adult as a child, or whatever. And to their amazement, they found out just the opposite was happening. When people had this level of protection of an avatar, they were very quick to be honest and open to complete strangers. Whereas in person, we would be very guarded. And so they found that the avatar was actually helping them to connect better with the people who attended.
Interesting, yeah. I think another big part of this whole conversation is that often when we're just solely online, though, if we're not engaging, like you're saying, like if we're just passively intaking the service and we're not engaging and we're not interacting, and I would say, from my perspective, in person would probably be the preferred, but if we're not doing that, then there's also a lot of increase in loneliness and isolation, and which can be connected to different mental health things. And so I think just being physically present it's helpful. And I think to your point though too, like if it's online, making sure to engage and be interactive with it. So.
Yep. And there were times during the pandemic where, depending on the rules for that week, you could have 5 people at your house or 10 people at your house. So you could invite your neighbors over or invite your extended family over to worship with you remotely from your house. And so we did that whenever it was permitted to do so. But sometimes we were told you can't have anyone at your house except the people who actually live there. So, and then it can get lonely with just your family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for this. Again, thanks for this conversation. Again, this is Visiting Online Church by Peter DeHaan. The website is posted in the general post about this, and I'll post it again so you have that. But I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for those who commented, and thanks for interacting with us.
And thank you, Gabe, for making this all happen.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. All right. Have a good day.
Bye.